Welcome to CIC News for You with the final video on the 1619 project. I have put a lot of research into this New York Times Magazine piece, and I will say up front that there is a lot of great material in this project, and it is a good read for adults. But read with caution. As stated by the leaders of this project, the contents are narratives, opinions, fiction, and poems, scattered with facts throughout. Just make sure you discriminate between the facts and emotional narratives and opinions. I've learned quite a bit from this project, as well as from the research I did to review slavery history. However, my review of this project is based on whether it is appropriate to roll out nationwide for K through 12. And my answer is a simple no, at least not for K through middle school. Point blank, the project 1619 is trying to promote the opinions, poems, and narratives with not a lot on hard facts. The project also uses emotions to promote guilt, as the author, Nicole, has stated. While this might be appropriate for seniors in high school or college, it is filling our younger kids with misconceptions from this project. For starters, how in the heck can you expect the younger kids to process or filter facts from opinions? You can't. I will try to make my point by providing you the agenda and some of the content, much of which is listed for all grades. To be honest, I could have done another one or two videos to prove my point, but I know enough now to support my opinion. All I ask is that you listen and read the information I am providing and make up your mind if this is appropriate for K through 12. It is your kids and my grandkids that are the subjects for this push for reparations and a redefinition of our history. Yes, reparations, the true underlying goal of this project, as clearly stated more than once by the director and journalist Nicole Hannah Jones. One last positive note is that the Pulitzer site is a great source for the 1619 project, but the sources are limited to the project, and that is wrong. Providing the unvarnished truth is not what this project does. The project provides the unvarnished view, but a single view by a small group of people. So it is varnished by those with an ulterior goal, and that is not to provide them the whole truth. Remember that, because there are more than a few historians that object to Nicole's material. And as I have stated, there are factual errors that have not been corrected. Even when pushed for corrections, the New York Times and Nicole said no. That tells you something right from the start. They didn't even care to correct the documented factual mistakes or unfactual mistakes. All right, let's get started. This slide is a general overview of some of the comments surrounding the 1619 project that I think you should be aware of before we go into the detailed content of the project. This project is already in over 3,500 classrooms in all 50 states. This is scary, and I think this was done without the knowledge from my parents. In my opinion, you'll have to tell me. I find it very interesting that a dozen Civil War scholars, now get that, scholars, not journalists, complained about the misinformation. That is significant, and the statement that the remedy for past historical oversights is not their replacement by modern oversights tells it like it is. Yes, let us upgrade our outdated texts for our children with the unvarnished truth. But let's not replace history with a varnished, one-sided story. This project is only unvarnished from a narrow, single view and is emotional with the intent to promote guilt. Our children do not need to see a one-sided view of history to make them feel guilty. These kids, particularly at the younger ages, need to see diversity and humanity as the future, not be put on a guilt trip for political reasons, especially for our past mistakes that cannot be changed, erased, or reframed. Now get this. The executive editor of the New York Times sums up the goal of this project well and states that this project is filtered through the prism of race. Why in the world would this be acceptable at the K through 12 levels when we should be focusing on facts, unvarnished facts, and diversity? Finally, what about the statement from an admirer of the project that says it ignores the role of the African chieftains who kidnapped blacks to sell? Exactly. Complicit silence is the greatest flaw of this project. This project is a single view through a single lens, as stated by the executive editor. That is very concerning. There is enough information on this single page to doubt the applicability for use in K through 12. But there is more. Let's continue with the rest of my research. Okay, let's look at some of the details from the lesson plan that starts with a review of an excerpt from Nicole's essay, The Idea of America. I read the complete piece so I could see what she was saying to our kids. I found this piece to be a very emotional, heartfelt article. But that is what it is, an emotional piece from Nicole's perspective. Now remember, the audience, K through 12. This is recommended for all grades. Let's cover a few of the comments from the article. She states, "So when I was young, that flag outside our house never made sense to me. How could this black man, having seen firsthand the way his country abused black Americans, how it refused to treat us as full citizens, proudly fly its banner? I didn't understand his patriotism. It deeply embarrassed me." She's talking about her father. This statement makes me feel sad because no one in the United States should ever have to feel embarrassed about the flag and patriotism. I'm truly sorry that this is how Nicole felt growing up. But what about changes or improvements since her childhood? Have we not come a long way? Does progress not matter? I just wonder if she is still embarrassed. Nicole's statement about 20 Africans that came to Jamestown is an interesting piece of information that I did not know about. But she goes on to lie and state they were the beginning of slavery in America. These folks were not slaves, as many historians told the New York Times and Nicole, and yet they moved forward with publishing this report. In fact, these folks were not even the first of Africans in North America. That is a fact. This major piece of the project is historically wrong and is a slap in the face to true history. Let's continue, though. She says, Black Americans have also been and continue to be foundational to the idea of American freedom. More than any other group in this country's history, we have served generation after generation in an overlooked but vital role. It is we who have been the perfecters of this democracy. This statement is Nicole's opinion without facts, of course. And while I agree that Black Americans have been foundational to American freedom, to say more than any other group in our history is truly an opinion that I am sure others don't agree with. And there is no material in the project that would change my mind. The overall project is just like this. A lot of ideology with many opinions, periodically scattered with facts. Facts, as I've stated in my other videos, that should all be incorporated into our history books. That is without question. But in no way should this project replace our history. I'm not sure why more historians aren't speaking up, except maybe it has to do with the cancel culture. You speak up and you may lose your standing on campus or lose a promotion. Now that is a real travesty for all Americans expecting truth in history, not ideologies. The next statement bothers me And to state this without context takes away from the credibility of this project. She says, the United States is a nation founded on both an ideal and a lie. Our Declaration of Independence, signed on July 4th, 1776, proclaims that all men are created equal and endowed by their creators with certain unalienable rights. But the white men who drafted those words did not believe them to be true for the hundreds of thousands of black people in their midst. While at this time this certainly can be seen as a lie, there is no context about slavery in general, or where it started, or who started it. She seems to think that all of this is a U.S. initiated effort. Slavery, that is. Why is she not providing context for the kids? What about some context and perspective that Nicole decided not to mention from Thomas Jefferson himself? Thomas Jefferson, in an early version of the Declaration, drafted a passage that condemns slavery as one of the many evils of the colonies of the British Crown. But the passage was cut from the final wording. Decades later, in his autobiography, Jefferson blamed 2 southern states for the clause's removal. The clause was struck out in compliance to South Carolina and Georgia, who had never attempted to restrain the importation of slaves, and who, on the contrary, still wished to continue it. Our northern brethren also, I believe, felt a little tender under these censures. For though their people have few slaves themselves, yet they have been pretty considerable carriers of them to others. This seems to be a narrative that should be provided, but of course it is not included as part of this project. How about this final statement in Nicole's Idea of America? My father knew that it would take me years to understand that the year 1619 is as important to the American story as 1776. That black Americans, as much as those men cast in alabaster in the nation's capital, are the nation's true founding fathers, and that no people has a greater claim to that flag than us. A very compassionate feeling from Nicole, but maybe others might not agree with that statement. Calling black Americans as the true founding fathers is wrong, absolutely wrong, as well as saying no people has a greater claim to the flag. I don't even know how she can really believe this statement, and I find this statement very divisive. This is nothing more than an emotional overstatement of opinion to get a response. This is nothing about history. It is all about Nicole's view. But maybe that is just me. This statement just doesn't feel right. Okay, let's get to the bottom line though, the intended audience. This is intended for K through 12. I don't think so. This project needs more facts and less ideology and opinions. Ask yourself, how will this be presented to the younger ones? The ones that don't have a clue of life yet. This is wrong. And I am not sure many in middle school are ready for this. As far as high school goes, maybe 50% are ready for this heartfelt opinion. And maybe they can put things in perspective that the younger kids can't. But I'm not even sure of that. I am not taking anything away from Nicole and her work that I find interesting and progressive in thought. But this is not for K through 12, in my opinion. Before I continue to review the details of the 1619 project, I want to bring up some facts on history that Nicole seemed to ignore, and that I found out during my research on slavery. The more I learned, the more I had an issue with Nicole and the New York Times blaming the United States for all the issues in the world around slavery. While we had some really bad history on slavery, we have made so much progress, and we still have a lot more to go. But there are no mentions of progress or talk about pre-U.S. slavery, which both seem to be points that should be taught to our kids. From what I found out, it is no wonder Nicole excluded this material, because it doesn't meet her agenda for slave reparations. Complicit silence in this project is outrageous. In no way should this be taught in its current form in K through middle school. And I have my concerns about using this for high school students. maybe seniors, but that is pushing it, in my opinion. Let's look at the history of slavery for a few minutes to put everything into perspective, because slavery cannot be looked at specifically from a North American perspective. To exclude history and simply blame America in support of reparations fails to support the efforts to eliminate slavery on a global platform. How can the history leading up to 1619 be ignored? It can't, in my opinion. Why can't Nicole bring up the good things that this country has done to eliminate slavery? Maybe it doesn't fit her true intentions on reparations, in my opinion. So slavery goes way back to the 18th century, BC, in Babylon. And what about the 7th century BC, where the states of Greece, Sparta, and Athens depended entirely upon forced labor? In Sparta, the article states it is serfdom rather than slavery because these people were a conquered people living on their land, but forced to work it for Spartan masters. In my opinion, if you have masters, it's slavery. Now for Athens, the slaves have no rights. Some of the Athenian slaves were minors and died from work. Most Athenian slaves were domestic servants, which is common with slavery throughout history, even in the United States. All right, how about slaves in Rome in the 2nd century BC? These slaves were employed by the Romans and treated with great brutality. They were whipped, worked in chain gangs, and forced to engage as gladiators. Now, I didn't research this, but from what I could see in historical movies, such as Spartacus, most of these folks were white. That certainly doesn't fit the Nicole narrative. After the Roman Empire collapsed, slavery continues in and around the Mediterranean countries in the Middle Ages, 6th through 15th century. But these slaves were primarily used in households, offices, and armies. No matter where used, slaves are slaves, and it is wrong. And in all situations, abuse was common. A lot of slavery occurred in the Mediterranean because the geography provided a means that encouraged slave trade because of the water route to transport slaves throughout the world. This provided a convenient transport method for many unsophisticated tribes and border warfare that resulted in tribal captives. Add market forces, and these tribes were encouraged to seize prisoners to service the slave trade. I'm not getting into color because slaves are slaves, whether black, brown, white, red, or yellow. And I think that's got most of the colors from what I could look up. I just wanted to be politically correct. Next, you have the expansion of Germans in the 10th century, capturing so many Slavs that their racial name became the generic term for slave. The Russia now joins the fray, and slaves become an important part of their early economy. This is an interesting tidbit that Slavs became the generic term for slaves. Look it up. Look up the origin of the word slave and see for yourself. And there's more. The Arab dynasties along the coast stimulated the African slave trade, and the town of Zawali became a slave trading station in the Sahara. Slaves were sold to Arab households in a Muslim world in the 8th century that stretched from Spain to Persia. In fact, if you do your research, you will find this slavery still exists today. What about the trans-Saharan slave trade? Have you ever heard of it? Probably not, or at least I didn't until I did research for this project. This was slavery in the Arab world, mainly in Western Asia, North Africa, East Africa, and certain parts of Europe. And the slaves during this time were not limited to a certain race, ethnicity, or religion, and included Turks, Iranians, Europeans, and others. And there's more. During the 8th and 9th centuries, most of the slaves were Europeans captured along the European coast and during wars. And they were from a wide range of areas, including the Mediterranean, Persians, and peoples from mountain regions such as Georgia, Armenia, and parts of Central Asia. such as Scandinavia, English, Dutch, and Irish. Now, don't you think this should be part of the project if, in fact, Nicole wants to discuss slavery? I do. What about this tidbit from Wiki stating that in the late 15 and 1600s, observers estimate that around 35,000 European Christian slaves were held throughout this period, where the majority were sailors, particularly those who were English, taken with their ships, but others were fishermen and coastal villagers. Seems like from a historical perspective, no one is free of wrongdoing. Why leave all this information out? Seems to me Nicole is promoting a single narrative view to meet her goal and agenda, and it is not providing a true perspective of slavery in the U.S. or anywhere else. Our kids will bring home that the U.S. is the creator of slavery, and that is not true. And to top it off, we no longer have slavery, and probably are one of the few countries that continuously work to create diversity throughout our country. Where's this information? So what about the rest of the world? Notice the chart at the bottom left of this slide from 2014 about modern day slavery? Didn't you know it still exists? Look at these numbers, and they are in the millions upon millions. I would think this would be important to show how far the U.S. has come. But none of this is in the current project. Slavery is wrong in any way, shape, or form. But let's at least report the facts without ideology. What about China and the Uyghurs, which is not on this chart, and they are in the millions? As I stated earlier, slavery has existed in practically all civilizations throughout time. This was also the case in Africa even before settlers came. One more tidbit, and then we go into the details of 1619. I'm not sure if I'm going to get all these names right, so bear with me. Abdulaziz Lodi, Emeritus Professor of Swahili and African Linguistics at the University of Uppsala in Sweden, stated slavery was part of different African cultures. And when it comes to exports, tribal Africans themselves were the main actors. In many African societies, there were no prisons. So people who were captured were sold. Oh, wow. I think this is interesting. I could go on forever, but I won't. The information I provided is what I believe should be taught along with the unvarnished truth from our history, not a reframed history from Nicole in the New York Times. So that wraps up the lesson outline, but only the introductory reading and discussion on Nicole's idea of America. Do you still think the single-sided view of this project is appropriate for K through 12? I don't. The project is sparse on facts and filled with emotional events and opinions, mostly by journalists from the New York Times. I have a problem with that. Let's move on to the activities section of the 1619 project and start with a note from Jack Silverstein of the New York Times, who says, the goal of the project is to reframe U.S. history by considering what it would mean to regard 1619 as our nation's birth year. Doing so requires us to place the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are as a country. How convenient to start at a point they decide and leave out what led up to 1619 concerning slavery, or what has happened since from a positive perspective. Of course, they include all the negatives. This project is trying to focus on the United States as the owner of slavery, lock, stock, and barrel, and that is simply not true, as I have discussed. Again, remember the audience, K through 12. These are not adults, these are kids. These kids, in my opinion, will believe our country was responsible for slavery, when in my mind we progressed and removed slavery and continue to improve on diversity. You simply cannot reframe our history by trying to use one frame of reference with inaccurate facts. This should be embarrassing to historians. And again, why are they not speaking up? One activity that is listed in the project is to come together as a class to create a new timeline of U.S. history, starting with 1619. And work with your classmates to order the rest of the events you compile. Display your timeline along the wall and read your classmates' additions. This is listed for K through 12. That concerns me. This is a task to force a narrative or solution that is not true, but in the opinion of Nicole, supported by the New York Times. This is not history at all. I guess they would also have a task that says create a new timeline that starts in 1598 when the Mexicans arrived in present-day New Mexico. Or if they really want to reframe history, why not start with the Native Americans, the Indians? Why not use these timelines or these people as our founders and discuss where we would be? The 1619 Project is a single-sided narrative with a political goal. That's why. This might not be exactly the same thing, but you get the point. No single group or race is responsible for America. We are and have been the melting pot of the world, in my opinion. The 1619 Project is a narrative with a single ideology and lacks many facts and context. No way for this to be in K through 12. Seniors maybe, but college is appropriate where students can fill in the blanks that our younger kids can't. Not only is this project promoting a single view on our kids, but they want our kids to erase historical documents and rewrite our history. To ask our kids to erase and reframe our history is wrong in so many ways. As the project states, why not just provide the unvarnished facts? That would be appropriate, but that's not in the 1619 Project. History is history, and that is a fact. Erasing our historical documents doesn't change anything, but promotes division of our kids. That is horrible to use our kids for a social experiment, for a political objective. This is not at all appropriate for K through 12. This is a perfect example of our cancel culture, and we should not be teaching this to our kids, in my opinion. Look at the documents they want to erase. Declaration of Independence, 13th Amendment, and more. This is inappropriate for the intended audience. The project even states it is not factual, but a mix of historical research, personal reflection, analysis, and creative writing. You and I understand this is a political and opinionated piece, but will our younger kids? I don't think so. Let's look at the Analyze block of the 1619 Project, which starts with a video that is quite good. The Analyze block is for middle school, or suggested for middle school on up. So at least at this point, they are not suggesting this video is for the younger kids. But I'm still not sure this is appropriate for middle school. Maybe for some in high school. And college is a fine audience, in my opinion. I watched the video, which is an opinion and outline of the course, but found some of the comments interesting, such as, descendants of American slavery are telling the story. Don't you think there may be a bit of bias? This is like asking groups on the extreme right or left to tell a story. How would Antifa or the KKK tell America's story? You get the point. How about the statement, getting to the truth of America was to take control of the narrative? This statement shows they don't want anyone's facts or opinions that would counter what is being told. Sounds like a left-leaning or right-leaning publication to me where only their opinion matters. You can add that the New York Times has pushed out hundreds of thousands of copies to people who are not readers of the left-wing New York Times. Isn't this spreading a one-sided view of the world to the world? Yes, in my opinion. They are pushing this project as propaganda, and it is working. It is in your schools already, as they stated, and it is being taught in every state. And 7 school districts have made it mandatory high school curriculum. At least it's in the high school curriculum. How many of you know what is being taught to your kids? You should look into this to see if your kids are part of the experiment to roll this out to all schools. What about this statement in the film? We are as American or more American than anyone else. Oh, really? I'm not sure many Americans in the melting pot would agree to this. I certainly do not. We are a melting pot. And this statement is a pot with one group only, in my opinion. What if an Asian or Latino or European made such a comment? People would be outraged. All right. Overall, this is a good video if you can separate fact from opinion, and I suggest you watch it. The only positive is that this is being promoted at the higher grades, middle school on up. Although I still have concerns about the middle school aspect of this because I don't think they can understand completely what is being told. Some of this material is really good and shows that our history texts need to be updated. I'm all in favor of that. But in my opinion, it needs to be updated by historians, not journalists. You can see by the questions that there is an effort to get students to look at current teaching materials and to identify missing information, such as a true picture of slavery. That is good, and we need to update our texts as necessary. I have no problems with the unvarnished truth with context being included in our history textbooks. That would be a good task. These questions are good and thought-provoking for high school, maybe seniors, or college students. Again, this task should bring about updates to our history texts, and that is a good thing. This part of the project also explores underreported stories of Black Americans' contributions to the U.S. and is intended to examine the lasting impact of American slavery on the United States. That is a good thing, and it is good for seniors in high school or college, but not for younger students. We need to update history and we need to teach the truth to our kids. But the truth doesn't come from a one-sided view, in my opinion. Okay, I got all wound up on this video. That wraps up my series of videos on the 1619 project. And I do have to say I have learned quite a bit. And I think this could have been a great effort if it did not have an underlying goal of reparations, as well as a one-sided narrative from a one-sided group of people, mostly journalists. That is wrong. My biggest concern is that this is already rolling out with full support from the NEA and many school districts, especially in the inner cities. Just how much unity do you think this will promote in these schools? I think it will make a divisive environment a lot more divisive than it already is. A few changes and additional historian input could make this a great project instead of an opinionated narrative that many will find offensive. Bottom line is, I do not believe this is for K through middle school and not for most high school students. It would be a good fit in college as a liberal arts, general reading, or research assignment to dig into the misinformation and to add additional context or historical facts to our texts. I don't think this is a history course in any way. History should never be told by a one-sided view or primarily by New York Times journalists. Great stuff in this project, and I have provided you what I researched and my opinion. Hopefully you have enough information to make up your own mind on what you think about this project. It's got its good and it's got its bad. You just need to know the impact on your kids. I thank you all so much for watching all these videos. As always, it is appreciated. Have a great day. Be safe, be informed, and stay informed with CIC News for You. Signing off, Charlie.